Hello, could you help me grow this channel? Subscribing is totally free. Just one click below this video is all it takes.
The last time my mother remembered my birthday, I was 6 years old, and she only did because I had a fever so high I was hallucinating cartoon animals dancing on the ceiling. That night, she brought me ginger ale and dry toast, more out of fear I'd vomit on the couch than any genuine concern for me. I remember clutching the blanket and whispering, "It's my birthday," and she blinked at me like I'd just said the alphabet backwards. "Oh," she muttered, "is it?" That was the last time I got anything close to a celebration. Since then, every August 2nd felt like some secret holiday only I remembered. No calls, no texts, not even a pity card from the pharmacy rack. My younger sister, Emily, on the other hand, had birthdays that looked like Pinterest boards exploded in her honor. Balloons, themed cakes, Instagram-perfect brunches, and of course, gifts so generous they bordered on obscene. One year, she got a purebred golden retriever. Another year, she got a trip to Paris. The Paris trip stung the most, not because I wasn't invited, but because it was a month after our father died. And while I was drowning in grief and bills and his leftover junk, they were sipping champagne by the Seine. "It's what your father would have wanted," my mother had told me, which was funny, considering the old man hadn't spoken to Emily in the last 2 years of his life. So this year, when my 39th birthday rolled around, I wasn't expecting anything. I didn't even tell my coworkers, which is saying something because I work in a pediatric dental office where every minor excuse is a reason for cupcakes and glitter. I didn't need the pity. I didn't need the fake smiles. I didn't need anything really, just one quiet night without Emily's perfectly filtered face on my feed, holding up a mimosa and wearing a sash that said Birthday Queen. But instead, I got something else. At exactly 6:45 in the evening, there was a knock on my door, not a text, not a call, an actual knock, soft, unsure, like whoever was behind it wasn't entirely convinced this was a good idea. When I opened it, I saw my mother holding a tray with 2 porcelain cups, the kind she only used for company, and a thermos with steam rising from the lid. She was wearing that thin smile she saves for strangers and real estate agents. "Hi, Karen," she said, voice tight. I thought, maybe we could talk. I brought tea. I should have shut the door. I should have asked her what the hell she was doing here after forgetting 32 birthdays in a row. But instead, I stepped aside and let her in. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was weakness. Maybe deep down, I still wanted something from her. I don't know. But I let her into my living room, and we sat across from each other like 2 people who used to be friends before something terrible happened between them. She poured the tea like it was a ritual, 1 cup for me, 1 for her, and set the tray down with trembling hands. "Happy birthday," she said, and it felt like a lie in slow motion. I looked at her for a long second, waiting for the punchline, but there wasn't one. Just silence, and the smell of Earl Grey with a hint of lemon. I didn't say thank you. I just stared at the cups and wondered which one was mine. She nudged one toward me. The other stayed close to her, and for a second, just one, I thought about all those missed years. All those times she picked Emily up from school and left me waiting in the rain. All those Christmases where my gift was a pair of socks while Emily got plane tickets. All those therapy sessions where I tried to convince myself I was over it, that I didn't care, that it didn't matter. And then Emily walked in. Of course she did. Of course she was part of this. She swept in with her perfect posture and her 2 white teeth, laughing like this was some charming surprise reunion. She kissed my mother on the cheek and flopped onto the couch beside me like we were best friends in a sitcom. "Mom said she wanted to make things right," she said, grinning. "Isn't that sweet?" Sweet wasn't the word I'd have used. I looked at the 2 cups, still untouched, still steaming, still just there. I smiled, tight, controlled, and picked one up. My mother was watching me now, her fingers twitching in her lap, eyes flicking between me and the cup. I turned to Emily and offered her the tea. "Here," I said, voice light. "You take this one." She blinked, surprised. "Oh, are you sure?" I nodded. "Absolutely." She took it, a little confused but pleased, because Emily always assumed good things were meant for her. I picked up the other cup, but I didn't drink it. I just held it in my hands, warming my palms, watching my sister sip. My mother didn't move, didn't blink. 5 minutes passed, then Emily coughed. Just once, a light one, barely noticeable. But something in my mother's face changed. Her lips parted, her eyes widened. Emily coughed again, harder this time, and I saw her hand tremble slightly as she set the cup down. I leaned back against the couch and said nothing. Let them wonder. Let them remember. Because for the first time in 39 years, they were paying attention. There's something almost sacred in the silence that follows a room where someone just might be dying, where time slows down into strange little frames, like snapshots flickering in slow motion. And every breath, every glance, every twitch of a muscle becomes a decision. A potential last one, soaked in uncertainty and dread. Emily's second cough wasn't alarming, not at first. It was tight, dry, the kind of sound people make when they've swallowed wrong or when tea hits the throat in a weird way. I kept my eyes on her without looking like I was staring, watching her fingers adjust around the cup's handle, watching the way her shoulders lifted and fell a little quicker than before, as if her body had suddenly remembered it was responsible for keeping her alive. She shifted on the couch, reaching for the napkin my mother had folded too perfectly and placed beside the tray like we were at some high-end hotel lounge. And she dabbed her lips, laughing softly, brushing off her little spell like it was nothing, like she was still the composed favorite who didn't let her mascara smudge, even when she couldn't quite catch her breath. "Ugh, must have gone down the wrong pipe," she muttered, smiling the way people do when they're trying to control a room, trying to convince everyone that nothing's wrong, especially when something is definitely wrong. And then came the third cough. This one snapped, wet, violent, sudden. Her back arched slightly, as if her body was revolting, like it wanted out of itself. I turned my cup in my hands, slowly tracing the rim with my thumb, and said nothing. My mother, who hadn't touched her tea at all, stared at Emily like she was watching a ghost materialize, and her mouth opened but no words came out. She didn't ask if Emily was okay. She didn't even move. She just froze, like she was waiting to see what I'd do. That's when I knew. I knew she wasn't here because she wanted to apologize. She was here to see what would happen. She was testing something, testing me. Emily put the cup down, but it clinked awkwardly, not because the table was unsteady, but because her hands were. She rubbed her throat, then her chest, as if she could massage the discomfort away, but her breathing had changed. It wasn't panic yet. Not exactly, but it was wrong, shallow, uneven, like someone trying to breathe through a straw. That's when I smiled. It wasn't a big smile, not the kind you give when you're gloating or showing off. No, it was smaller than that, subtle and sharp, the kind of smile a person makes when the scales finally start to tip back in their direction after a lifetime of imbalance. It was the kind of smile that doesn't say, "I'm happy." It says, "I see you." And I wasn't smiling at Emily. I was smiling at our mother. She looked at me, finally, really looked. And I saw it, just for a second, the flicker of something ancient in her eyes. Not fear, not guilt. Something colder, recognition. She knew that I knew. That the switch wasn't an accident. That I had chosen which cup to take, just like she had chosen which daughter mattered more. And now, just like then, she had picked wrong. Emily leaned forward, her breathing growing more strained, and I could hear the tiny wheeze tucked behind each inhale, like the rattle of a door that won't shut all the way. "Karen," she said, voice rasping now. What's in this tea?" But she was looking at Mom when she said it, not at me, because even in this moment, choking, unsure, scared out of her mind, she still believed I was the harmless one, the background daughter, the afterthought. And in her mind, only our mother could be behind something like this. And maybe she was, maybe she wasn't, but that wasn't the point. I leaned back, crossed one leg over the other, and tilted my head. "How does it feel?" I asked softly. Being the one that's scared, the one that's unsure. Emily blinked rapidly. Her eyes were starting to glass over. Our mother stood up then, suddenly like she'd remembered her role in all this. Remembered she was supposed to be the protector, the fixer, the matriarch. And she moved toward Emily like she meant to help, arms extended, fingers twitching with uncertainty. But Emily recoiled. Not much, just a little flinch. And it was enough to send a message loud and clear. She didn't trust her anymore. Not with this. Maybe not ever again. And that, for me, was the real beginning of the unraveling. Not the coughing, not the gasping, not even the wheeze that made its way up her throat like a death rattle in slow motion. It was the look. That look Emily gave me when she realized she might be dying and that I wasn't reaching for her, wasn't moving to help, wasn't even pretending to care. That look of betrayal, so pure, so deep, it could have carved stone. And yet, behind that look, I saw something else. Confusion, doubt, because for all her perfect birthdays, her expensive schools, her magazine cover smile, she'd never truly understood me, never wondered why I never fought back, never spoke up, never tried to compete. She thought I was weak, but weakness doesn't hold grudges for decades. Weakness doesn't smile when the golden child starts to crack. That's when Mom said it. Just one sentence, 4 little words that twisted the whole room into a noose. "Why her?" Her voice cracked, quiet and raw, and I couldn't tell if she was asking me or herself. But I answered anyway, because she never had to ask. Emily was wheezing harder now. My mother knelt beside her, trying to help, but it was clumsy, unsure, like she couldn't tell if she was saving her daughter or just acting like a mother was supposed to act. And I just sat there sipping my tea. Room temperature now. Perfect. There's a certain weight to memory when it's tied to pain, not the sharp, clean kind that comes from sudden heartbreak or fresh betrayal, but the slow-dripping, decades-long kind that seeps into the joints of your bones and settles behind your ribs like damp rot in an old house. Sitting in that living room, watching my sister fight for air while our mother fumbled beside her like a nurse trying to remember which end of the patient the stethoscope goes on. I wasn't just watching a moment unfold. I was living inside a film reel of everything that had ever brought me to that precise second. And it wasn't rage that held me still. It wasn't vengeance either. It was memory, thick and heavy, pressing against my skin like a blanket soaked in rain. I was 12 the year I stopped believing my mother was capable of loving me in any normal, maternal sense of the word. That was the year she forgot my birthday for the 3rd time in a row. Not because she was distracted or grieving or overwhelmed with life, but because she simply didn't care enough to remember. And when I came home from school that day, holding the sad little cupcake a classmate's mom had sent me with a plastic candle jammed into its center, she asked me if I'd finished my homework, not even glancing at the date on the wall calendar she used to track Emily's dance recitals and orthodontist appointments. I stood there in the doorway of the kitchen, wearing a handmade paper crown from Mrs. Palmer's 6th grade class, and said nothing. Because by then, I had already learned that reminding her didn't help. It only made her annoyed, made her roll her eyes and say things like, "You're too old to be counting birthdays," or, "We'll celebrate this weekend, when I'm not so busy." We never did. But what I remembered more clearly than the empty birthdays was what happened later that same year. A Thursday night in late October, the house smelled like burnt popcorn and pine salt, and I had come downstairs for water because I couldn't sleep. That's when I heard voices. Not arguing, something lower, quieter, like 2 people sharing a secret they weren't sure they were allowed to say aloud. I crept toward the kitchen, the linoleum cold under my feet, and peeked around the corner. I saw my mother, standing by the sink, her back to me, and a man, not my father, sitting at the table nursing a half-empty glass of wine. He was older, with a tired face and hands that looked like they'd built things. He said something I couldn't hear, but she laughed. Not the polite kind, not the tight little chuckle she gave Dad when he made a bad joke. It was a full laugh, the kind she never gave to us. Then she said, "She doesn't need much. Karen's quiet. You know how easy she is." Easy. That word lived in my chest for years, like a tick you don't realize has burrowed into you until it's fed so long it starts to itch. From that moment on, I stopped asking her for anything. No birthday parties, no help with homework, no rides to school when it rained. Emily, of course, got everything without even asking. Ballet lessons, violin, therapy after her stress episodes in junior high. When she turned 16, they surprised her with a used Volkswagen and a bow on top. I took the bus until college, but that night, standing in the dark outside the kitchen, something shifted in me. I stopped needing her to care. And once you stop needing someone, really needing them, the power they hold over you begins to evaporate like sweat in a breeze. You can pretend, sure. You can smile at Thanksgiving and send polite texts on Mother's Day. But underneath it all, you're free. And yet, the thing about being free is that sometimes you don't realize how tightly the past still grips your ankles until it pulls. Which brings me back to the couch, to the tea, to Emily's increasingly ragged breathing. My mother, frantic now, had begun to panic in earnest. She was calling Emily's name over and over, like repetition could reverse whatever was happening, like sheer volume could clear an airway. I said nothing. I let the memory of that October night swirl in my head, like smoke from a dying fire, and I watched as the woman who used to forget my face at school pickups tried to summon the strength to save the daughter she always remembered. That's when the question surfaced, uninvited but impossible to ignore. Was this really about tea? Because here's the thing. When my mother offered me that cup, when she nudged it toward me with trembling hands and eyes that wouldn't meet mine, I saw something behind the gesture, a challenge, a trap. Maybe not poison, not literally, but something darker. Maybe she had hoped I'd drink it and feel sick, and she'd be able to say I was overreacting, that I was always the dramatic one, or maybe she expected me to refuse and prove once again how ungrateful I was, how impossible to please. Maybe deep down, this had been her version of control, one final test of loyalty dressed up as a peace offering. But I didn't take the cup she meant for me. I switched them. And as Emily's face shifted from confusion to panic, I realized that I might never know what was really in that tea, or if anything was in it at all. It didn't matter anymore. The damage was already done, not by the contents of a ceramic cup, but by the lifetime that had led us to this moment. 1,000 tiny betrayals, 100 missing candles, the years of silence, the way she always held Emily a little longer, a little tighter. My mother looked at me then, really looked. And for the first time in my life, I think she saw me, not the quiet one, not the background, not the easy daughter, just me. And I leaned forward slightly, the tea cooling in my hands, and said 4 words I'd been waiting a lifetime to say. "Interesting choice," I said. Then I smiled. The weight of silence after my words landed in the room was like fog thickening by the second, making it harder to breathe. Not from lack of air, but from the sudden presence of something dense and invisible pressing down on every surface, every breath, every unspoken word that had been fermenting for decades between us. My mother didn't respond. She didn't blink or flinch or show any visible reaction, which, somehow, made it worse. It would have been easier if she'd shouted or cried or cursed at me, accused me of cruelty or madness or jealousy, because that would have given me something solid to push against, something to fight. But the absence of reaction told me more than any words could have. It told me she already knew. Emily, who now leaned against the side of the couch, wheezing and pale, was clutching her chest like she could somehow compress her lungs back into working order with sheer will. Her wide, confused eyes darted between us, and if she still had enough air to speak, I think she would have begged me to explain what the hell was going on. Not because she thought I'd poisoned her, but because for the first time in her entire life, She realized there were conversations that had been happening just outside her awareness for years. Conversations where she wasn't the center, where her name wasn't always spoken with affection or pride. My mother finally stood up, slowly, her hands shaking, not from fear of what was happening to Emily, but from the slow dawning horror that maybe, just maybe, her tidy little system of keeping everything in its place was starting to fall apart. She looked at me then with an expression I didn't recognize. Not anger, not guilt, not sadness. It was something closer to resignation, like a tired queen realizing her throne was made of sand. "I didn't," she started, then stopped, pressing her lips into a thin line. "I didn't know you'd—" You thought what?" I asked, my voice low, even. "That I'd take the cup like a good little girl and thank you for it? That I'd swallow whatever you handed me like I've swallowed everything else since I was old enough to realize birthdays in this house were a privilege, not a promise?" Emily whimpered beside us, a ragged sound that pulled my eyes back to her for a second. And for that one brief moment, I remembered the girl she used to be. The one who used to hold my hand when we were little, who used to braid my hair even though she was younger, who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms because Mom didn't like being woken up. I remembered the softness in her voice when she used to ask if I was okay after I'd had a nightmare. That version of Emily didn't exist anymore. Or maybe she'd just been buried under years of glitter and attention and the smug safety that came from always being chosen. "Why her?" my mother whispered again, more to herself this time, her voice cracking. And I laughed. Not loud, not cruel, just a breathy, bitter sound pulled from some cavern deep in my chest. "You're still asking the wrong question," I said, rising from my seat, cup still in hand. "It was never about her." She looked at me then like I'd said something in a language she didn't understand. So I gave her the translation. "She's not even yours, is she?" The room tilted. Emily coughed, choked on a gasp. My mother's hands dropped to her sides. The silence that followed was absolute. "I was 12, I continued, stepping closer. "I saw the man, the one in the kitchen. I heard the way you laughed with him. Heard the way you talked about me like I was some side character in your movie. I thought maybe you were just cheating on Dad, but now I'm thinking something else." She didn't deny it. Didn't flinch, didn't speak, which was all the confirmation I needed. "I didn't understand then," I said, my voice growing quieter, more focused. "I just thought you loved her more, that it was favoritism. But it wasn't that simple, was it? She's not even yours, not really. You raised her, sure, but she's not your blood. I am." Her shoulders sagged under the weight of the truth. "And still," I said, stepping even closer, lowering my face until I was inches from hers, "you chose her, every time, every birthday, every holiday, every lie." She swallowed hard, eyes flickering with something I almost mistook for shame. "You tried to poison me, didn't you?" I asked, softly now, so only she could hear it. "That tea you gave me, was that your final little game? One last chance to make sure I knew my place?" She shook her head, but her mouth stayed closed, because she couldn't deny it, not without lying again. And I think, for once, she didn't have the strength to keep lying. "I just wanted peace," she whispered finally. "Just one day where we weren't fighting." I stared at her. "That wasn't peace," I said. "That was a performance." She looked down at Emily, who had sunk further into the couch, eyes closed now, chest rising and falling like it was learning how to breathe all over again. "You didn't just choose her," I continued, not shouting, not accusing, just stating facts like reading names off a list. "You erased me to do it," and she said nothing. Because the truth, once it's out, doesn't need help cutting into flesh. It does the work on its own. The sound of Emily's labored breath filled the room again, louder now, more desperate. Sirens wailed somewhere in the distance. Someone must have called. Not me. I hadn't touched my phone. My mother knelt again beside the couch, gently brushing Emily's hair away from her forehead, whispering words I couldn't hear. Maybe prayers, maybe apologies, maybe more of the same old lies. And I just stood there, tea still in my hands, untouched, watching them crumble under the weight of a history they both helped write. And for once, I felt nothing, not guilt, not fear, just clarity. The sirens drew closer with a steady urgency, slicing through the thick summer air like an alarm clock jolting someone from a nightmare. Not because they hadn't heard the danger coming, but because they'd convinced themselves it would never arrive. That somehow the world would keep turning no matter how many lines they blurred or how many truths they tried to bury. I stood in the center of the living room, still holding the cup of now cold tea, the porcelain cool and smooth against my fingers, and as the rising wail of the ambulance echoed through the open window, I watched the scene before me with a strange detachment, like a witness to someone else's family tragedy, like I was standing behind glass, protected by years of invisibility that had finally turned to armor. Emily's body had slumped further into the cushions, her breathing ragged and uneven, shallow gasps punctuated by panicked little sounds that made it clear she was fighting. Not for attention this time, not for praise or a new dress or another trip to Europe, but for the very thing none of us could give her anymore, air. Her lips had begun to take on a bluish tint. Not dramatic, not like in the movies, but just enough to make you know something inside her was slipping, something fundamental. My mother was crouched beside her, still whispering words I couldn't hear, her hand trembling as it rested uselessly on Emily's knee, not because she didn't want to help, but because finally she didn't know how. And that was the moment I understood the difference between punishment and consequence. Because I hadn't poisoned anyone, not in the way people expect when they hear a story like this, not with chemicals or vials or powder hidden in the folds of my sleeve. The truth was, I hadn't even touched the tea my mother poured for me. I'd only switched the cups because I didn't trust her, because my gut, seasoned by years of being forgotten and misjudged, told me that anything handed to me with that much hesitation came with a cost. But I hadn't added anything. I hadn't tampered. I'd simply shifted the weight of responsibility back where it belonged. And what happened next? Well, that wasn't on me. The paramedics burst through the door with practiced efficiency, all uniforms and clipped voices and medical bags unzipped with purpose, and the air changed instantly, filled with their movements, their calm chaos, their questions that no one seemed ready to answer. One of them asked my mother what Emily had consumed, and she hesitated, looking at me before mumbling something about tea. Earl Grey with lemon, nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. I said nothing. I didn't need to. My silence wasn't a shield anymore. It was a spotlight. As they worked over Emily, attaching oxygen, checking vitals, unwrapping syringes, my mother sat back on her heels, exhausted and hollowed out, and for the first time in a long time, she looked old. Not just in the way time ages a person, but in the way secrets do, in the way decades of pretending everything's fine slowly leach the color from your soul. She looked up at me, her eyes not pleading, not angry, just tired. And in that look, I saw all the things she would never say. And I didn't need her to, because the truth had already been spoken in the silence that followed my switch, in the fear that bloomed in her eyes the second Emily began to cough, in the way she froze instead of rushing to help, unsure of which daughter she'd just failed. Emily was stable by the time they lifted her onto the stretcher, her breaths coming easier now, the oxygen having done its job, though her eyes were still dazed, unfocused, as if she were trying to understand what had just happened, not just to her lungs, but to the world she thought she understood. As they wheeled her out, one of the paramedics asked who would be accompanying her, and my mother, without looking at me, said she would. Of course she would. That was always the choice. She followed them out without another word, her back straight, her shoulders squared like a soldier heading into battle, and I stood at the window, watching the ambulance door close, watching the red lights paint the street in pulsing streaks, and I felt something shift. Not satisfaction, not vengeance, not even justice, something quieter, something like closure, but with edges still left raw. I walked back to the living room and sat down, finally placing the untouched cup on the tray, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner and the quiet creaks of a house still holding its breath. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It was deeper now, more final. The kind of silence that follows confession, that fills the space after a secret has changed everything. And in that silence, I thought of the irony, how all it took to make them see me was one cup of tea and a lifetime of being ignored. I didn't call anyone. I didn't post anything. I didn't cry. Instead, I walked into the kitchen, washed the cups slowly under warm water, dried them with the same cloth my mother used for guests, and set them back in the cabinet side by side, identical again. Then I sat at the table, folded my hands, and waited. Because eventually someone would ask me what happened, and I would tell them the truth, or maybe I wouldn't. Maybe I'd just smile and say, "Some people call it revenge. I call it a long overdue birthday gift." And let them wonder what was really in that tea, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is leave them guessing.